Today I want to talk about Starfield and that showcase. There was a whole load of things that we saw, a load of information. I'm going to be making some deep dive videos over the coming days and the coming weeks, so do keep an eye out for that. But with so much content and so very many videos to produce, I really just wanted to sit down for a while and give you my thoughts and feelings on what we saw yesterday. So these are just some of my initial impressions. And yes, that does mean that this is going to be one of my rambling videos, so heads up, just so that you know. Of course, yesterday I did release that video on the Starfield planets because, yes, I was very impressed with them and just really wanted to get that out there as soon as I really could. So we will touch on planets again in this video, but won't need to go into quite so much depth. Do have a look at that video if you haven't seen it yet. Now, one thing I do want to get out of the way is the notes about hype. I've seen some people saying there's way too much hype for Starfield and people are just going to feel let down as time goes on. This is partly understandable because there's been a lot of AAA game releases over the past year, or over the past many years, but especially in 2023, that have had, well, a few problems to say the least and led to a lot of disappointment. Now, my take on this is that it's perfectly reasonable to be hyped and even excited about Starfield. And personally, as it's a Bethesda title, I'm fully expecting it to be full of bugs. There's also going to be people who have their hype expectations way too high and will undoubtedly be disappointed. But for everyone else, I think, yeah, Starfield is going to be a good game, but keep your expectations in check. As for pre-orders, it's not something I do. If you want to pre-order, go ahead. I'm not going to dare stop you or dare say don't do that. Everyone needs to make their own decisions on that. But just to be clear, it's not something I do. At any rate, that's the discussion on the hype train out of the way. I don't want to touch on that for too long. Let's move in to that Starfield showcase. It's definitely then, undoubtedly, that Starfield is a space game, a pretty big one at that. 1,000 planets, very impressive to see. Love the look of the planets. Some of them are undoubtedly going to be barren. That is not really a problem, I don't think, because there's going to be a lot of them that do look very nice indeed based upon what we've seen. And that is probably the real takeaway from me from the Bethesda Starfield showcase. That was planets looking so impressive. But as I said, Starfield is undoubtedly a space game. Not a space simulator, but a space game, and that means many activities, including some lovely looking spaceships. Now, I've got to say, I was impressed with the sheer customization possibilities with the spaceships. That did look good to me, both externally as well as, interestingly, internally as well. Swapping out the modules, allowing you to customize the interior of your ships, is going to be a very nice touch. And one thing that Bethesda really did emphasize here is that your ship is kind of going to be another character, meaning that it will have stats and various other requirements to it, but also that it's going to be your home. And that's always been a really big desire for me when it comes to space games. It's something that Elite Dangerous completely and utterly failed on, unfortunately. Even with their fleet carriers, they didn't deliver that sense of your ship being your home. But it is something that Star Citizen has gone for, and is undoubtedly one of the reasons that people have spent so much money on their rather great looking ships. Either way, Starfield's going to have entirely free ships that people can customize, so potentially some very good stuff there. But all that said, one area I'm fairly concerned about, or a little bit concerned about at least, is the space combat, the ship-to-ship combat. Very difficult, based on the videos, to see exactly what we can expect from this. Now, they did touch on the energy balance, the power distribution between lasers or weapons, the shields and the engines and all that lovely stuff. What they didn't really give it into, at least in too much detail, is showing us visually what the space combat looks like. Right here, you can see it looks a little bit arcadey. And of course, arcadey is not a problem. Everspace 2, after all, is one of the best space shooters out there, and it has fantastic arcadey style combat. My concern, though, is they're going down the No Man's route here and taking the skill right out of the equation. Unfortunately, we won't know for sure until we get hands-on experience from this. Videos are just not the way to judge this. At any rate, it seems to me that they're going for a bit of a balance right down the middle between something like Free Space, one of the best combat shooters out there in terms of space games, and something, well, very basic and hands-off like No Man's Sky. At any rate, time will tell. What did impress me, however, is the player's ability to disable other ships and then dock with them and board them. This will allow you to take the ship and make it your own. Seems pretty obvious then that Bethesda really do understand how people feel about spaceships, and they're going all in on letting you have a whole fleet of ships and letting you design them in whatever way you want. I'm also interested to see just how far Starfield goes with space-based phenomena. So are we going to be seeing black holes and comets? There was no signs of that in the showcase. Possibly not then, I would suggest. But well, there's always room for modding further down the line, and of course there's also room for surprises. I'm sure Bethesda haven't shown us everything. Either way, space is expansive, and it seems that Starfield are going through that route. I'm not going to comment too much just yet on the star map. It seems quite basic as far as things go, but it's nice to see that you can scan planets from orbit, from up in space, and that will give you an impression of some of the resources that those planets contain, as well as how and where you can find them. I've spoken before about the transition, the lack of seamless transition from space down to planets. That's not something that bothers me. I think it's something that is unnecessary. Elite Dangerous and Star Citizen have gone to great lengths to include it, and really I think it adds unnecessary time into the game. It's great for immersion, but I don't think it really adds much in terms of gameplay, at least not to a game like Starfield, which is not a space sim after all. So yeah, I'm sure everyone's going to have a different take on that, but for me personally, I'm very happy that planets and space is simulated in the sense that you can stand on one planet and see the orbiting parent body or the moon, but I don't really feel the need to be able to fly directly from the planet up into the atmosphere. We'll have to see how it works in practice. Okay, so with the space stuff out of the way, let's move on to story. For me, story has never been a major focus when it comes to Bethesda titles, whether that was Oblivion, Morrowind, Skyrim, or Fallout 3 or 4. I play them not for the story or the main campaign, but rather their sandbox and open world nature. When I think back on my time with those titles, I never remember the campaign, not really in any way at all, with the exception perhaps of Skyrim, where I remember certain parts of the Dragonborn story, certainly that first encounter with the dragon. In either event, for me, the focus really is on open world gameplay and going out there and trying out various different things, just keeping myself invested in that living world. At any rate, one thing that did stand out to me from the showcase in terms of story was those artifacts. Artifacts found in space, lost and abandoned, is of course a bit of a cliche, but the way that they're implemented into the story should be or could be potentially interesting. So what stood out to me? Well, if you remember right at the end of the showcase, there was a very short clip where the player seems to possess some type of telekinetic capabilities. It seems then, speculation here, that the player will have some sort of superpowers, not too dissimilar to the shouts that players had in Skyrim. My suspicion is that the artifacts will somehow power these capabilities just as the Dragon Souls powered shouts in Skyrim. And it seems there's a whole load to explore. Now, I did touch on this in the other planet-based video, so I won't go into too much depth on this. One thing I do want to mention again is the lack of certainty as to the scale of the maps, the area around the player. Bethesda did say that generally players will explore around the ship, around the area that they land. So this could be interpreted in a number of ways. It could be that players generally are not expected to roam too far away, but it also could be expected, or interpreted rather, that these maps are limited in scope to a certain distance, a certain radius from the player's ship. Whatever way that goes, one thing we do know is that the planets are procedurally generated. They are loaded in chunks around the player as they move around the planet, and sooner or later the player will encounter handcrafted content. So there's a mix here between procedural and handcrafted. For now, it's not certain just how far you'll be able to roam in a straight line. Now, another point here is there doesn't seem to be any mention of ground vehicles, and also Bethesda didn't show nor mention the ability to fly your spaceship around on the surface of planets. So it seems that once the ship has landed, it's landed, and the only time you'll be taking off again is to head back into space. Exploration then and encounters lead us on to one of the other things I want to talk about. When you have encounters, chances are that sooner or later you're going to get involved in combat. And if we really get down to it, single-player Bethesda titles are not really known for having great combat. In my experience, I feel that Skyrim had functional combat at best. It was good enough. It did the job. Fallout 4 combat was a little bit better, so slightly above functional, I'd say. How does it feel with Starfield? Well, it seems that's something, again, we're not going to really know for sure until we get hands-on experience. One thing I will say is that combat seems vastly improved in this showcase compared to the showcase from last year. Last year, combat seemed a little bit bullet spongy, a little bit on the slow side. This time around, it seems as though the weapons have a far more kick. You also see the impact of your shots and the reaction on the enemies. They have some decent animations going on there, which is a bit of a step up over the previous showcase. And I think also the gunplay feels a little bit faster. So nowhere near the standards of a dedicated FPS game, but certainly it seems way better than what we've seen in other Bethesda titles. So yeah, it's important to get combat right. We've all seen games and add-ons and expansions which add FPS combat or focus on FPS combat that just isn't very good, and ultimately it really undermines the entire experience of the whole game. So yeah, Starfield does need to get this right, and at least based on the showcased clips, the curated clips that we've seen here, it does seem to be fairly decent. There was another subject, and that is the subject of performance on consoles. A lot of people have been wondering about this, although it's nice to have it confirmed. I think we've kind of got the impression of what to expect a few months ago, and I'll get back to that in just a moment. Either way, Todd Howard has confirmed that the Xbox Series X will be running at 4K for Starfield and be locked at 30 frames per second. The Series S, meanwhile, will be running at 1440p and also locked to 30 frames per second. It seems the PC will be able to go higher. Todd seemed to suggest that they've seen Starfield running at up to 60 frames a second, but no mention really of it going beyond that. So maybe on PC you'll be able to get 60 frames per second. Yeah, now personally on PC I'd like to see more than that. If you've got the hardware, why not go as far as the hardware would let you? In terms of consoles, well, again, a bit disappointing because some of the recent titles that have had 60 frames per second do look really smooth and really great, and once you're used to that, you really do notice the lower performance in terms of 30 frames per second. But it really shouldn't come as a surprise. In a podcast between Todd Howard and Lex Friedman, Todd said that when it comes to performance, Bethesda prefer to focus on fidelity, and by that he means the ability to have a simulated world and lots of activity going on in there. A living, breathing world then, and this comes at a cost, which of course is performance. For me, I'd much rather have a living, breathing world where it's full of things I can interact with, and unfortunately runs at 30 frames per second, rather than a lifeless, barren world that runs at 60 frames per second. Guess just so long as it doesn't drop below 30 frames per second. If we end up in 20 frames per second or 15 frames per second territory, then there would certainly be problems there, and justifiably so. So there we have it. That's my thoughts and fill-ins on what we've seen in the Bethesda showcase. Not a deep dive, as I said early on. This is more of a rambling video, but we will go into those deep dive videos over the coming days, so do keep an eye out for that. There's a lot to discuss. At any rate, let me know your thoughts and feelings about what we've seen in the comment section below. Is there anything that really stood out for you in the Starfield showcase? Is there anything that disappointed you? Either way, I'd love to hear from you. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys and girls next time.